while we are now in this period of paying attention to the start of the Great War, I think there is a danger that only military heroes will be remembered. And there were such heroes, to be sure. And it is altogether proper that we, on Remembrance Day, pause to honor those who died in all of Canada's wars. But not all heroes carried weapons. And we're here tonight to honor Emily Hobhouse, a hero for peace, and to recognize her life-saving work in both of Canada's first overseas war, the Boer War, and the Great War, which is being remembered particularly this year. I learned of Emily Hobhouse as I researched my first non-legal book, which I hope will be out sometime next year from McGill-Queen's University Press. It's titled Still Marching, ? Pierre Berton, Canada, and Other People's Wars. And it is a challenge to the argument that the coming of age at Vimy Ridge defined us as Canadians as a nation. The more I learned about Emily in researching that book, the more my admiration grew for her, just exponentially. So I want to give you a little bit of the background of Emily Hobhouse and her times before we talk about the amazing things that she did in the cause of basic humanity and of peace. We can't understand the magnitude of her heroism without some background of the time. She was born in 1860 and died in 1926, and these were very interesting times in the history of Canada and of the world. As Jenny writes, most of Emily's life was in an era when women were expected to be good, obedient, and pure. Obedient, Emily was not, and we are all the better off for that. And I will tell you that my goal tonight is not just to inform you about the life and work of this remarkable woman, but also to suggest to you that her accomplishments in the cause of peace, in the face of daunting obstacles that I will describe for you briefly, leave all of us with no excuse to shirk our own responsibility for peace. While Emily was not wealthy, her family was well connected. Her uncle Arthur was a peer of the realm and a member of the Privy Council. You will recall that that is the highest court of the empire, and until 1949 it was the highest court of appeal for Canada. And Emily's brother Leonard. Arthur and Leonard were liberals who believed in the rights of small nations. She was aided in her work during the Boer War by liberal MP Leonard Courtney, whose wife, Kate, incidentally, was a sister of Beatrix Potter, for those of you who are really Anglophiles. And significantly, she was also helped during that war by none other than David Lloyd George, who also opposed the Boer War. So a little bit of background about the Boer War in order to understand what Emily did. That war from 1899 to 1902 came at the height of British imperialism. In Africa, the legendary Cecil Rhodes, for example, said, "I would annex the planets if I could." But there were two kinds of imperialism, both of them, to be sure, racist. For example, Sir Alfred Milner, who was the British High Commissioner for South Africa, with whom Emily had to deal and who she ran circles around, I might add, said this: the white man must rule because he is elevated by many steps above the black man, steps it will take the latter centuries to climb. A bit about the Boer. The Boers were farming descendants of Dutch colonists and called themselves Afrikaners. And the British war against them was a classic fight between whites over the resources of people of color. Gold, in this case, which was discovered in the Transvaal in 1886. And fortune seeker Rhodes clumsily tried to start a war, to provoke the war, to get at the gold. But the Boers finally had to be provoked by Rhodes's ally, Milner. Rhodes and Milner are perfect examples of the union of capitalism and imperialism. Rhodes relied upon the government to promote his economic ventures and make him a wealthy man. Like the Great War, for which this was in fact a dress rehearsal, the British propaganda announced when the war broke out that there would be an easy victory and that the troops would be home by Christmas. In researching this book, I have to tell you that whenever a war starts anytime in the late summer or the early fall, the word is always that we'll win by Christmas. The general assumption of the people here in Canada about this war, if they remember about it at all today, is that Canada at the turn of the century all Canadians were all in for British imperialism. Any place, any time. That's not quite the case. A propaganda campaign of lies and distortions, demonizing the Boers, helped to draw the public in to support that war in Britain and here in Canada. And this was no easy task, because the Boers were not your basic savage heathens to be conquered. This was another group of white Christians. But the propaganda was up to the task. Sadly, this task was also aided by the churches. Pierre Burton said that Canadians believed in war as they believed in the Bible. And for the mainstream Protestant churches in Canada, every British war was by definition a just war. That has often been my problem with organized Christianity and the just war doctrine. They never seem to find a war that's not just, that's their side, and so it was with the Boer War. So the glorious war got underway in 1899. Enter Emily Hobhouse. Always motivated by a desire to help others, she had gone to the U.S. to aid Cornish miners who had immigrated there, and while there she visited those in prison. She started a library and she did other good works. But at the start of the war, she had come back to England after a failed love affair. Meanwhile, the quick, glorious British victory did not materialize. The Boers were stubborn, they knew the terrain, and they refused to fight fair. That is, according to outdated European rules of combat. And after the British, who were materially aided by the splendid performance of Canadian troops, conquered all the major towns and cities in the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, the British thought the war was over. It wasn't. The Boers continued to resist with a strike and disappear guerrilla war, and it was then that the British decided to make war on women and children and the native laborers who lived with them. Saving them became Emily's cause. The first phase of this campaign against civilians was led by popular general Lord Roberts, Abraham Roberts, but he turned over command later to Kitchener. And decorating Roberts, by the way, was the last official act of Victoria before her death. Roberts decided that the raiding guerrillas were being aided by their families, and so their farms should be burned. And 600 farms were burned down in 1900. Now, this is the first of something that makes the spoken word inadequate. I have to ask you, and I will ask you several times, to try to conjure up an image of what was happening rather than just a verbal description. Can you picture the burning down of a family's farm? I can try to help a little bit. A Canadian Lieutenant, E.W.B. Dinky Morrison, described the scene this way. We moved from valley to valley, lifting cattle and sheep, burning, looting, and turning the women and children to sit and cry beside the ruins of their once beautiful farmsteads. A British soldier also in the campaign wrote this: "The worst moment is when you first come to the house. The people thought we had called for refreshments, and one of them went to get milk. Then we had to tell them that we came here to burn the place down. We rode away and left them, a forlorn little group, standing among their household goods, beds, furniture, and gimcracks strewn about the veldt, the crackling of the fire in their ears, and the smoke and flame streaming overhead." Roberts then turned over command to Kitchener, who escalated the war on civilians. He herded the displaced women and children, 160,000 of them, into concentration camps. In the beginning, the women with husbands out fighting got less food than other inmates. For everyone in the camps, there were no vegetables, no fresh milk for the children and the babies. Overcrowding and foul water and poor sanitation invited disease, of course, and 28,000 civilians died in Kitchener's camps, twice the number of Boers killed in combat, along with 12,000 people of color. Many, many more would have died had it not been for Emily Hobhouse. Now, Milner saw the public relations problem created by the camps, and even though Kitchener was calling them voluntary refugee camps, and at one point even blamed the illnesses and death on poor parenting by the Boer mothers. So Milner imposed censorship. No journalist dared to print the truth before Emily Hobhouse took up the cause. She founded a group called the South African Women and Children's Distress Fund, raised money, and went to South Africa with 2 carloads of supplies for the camp inmates. Through family connections, she got a meeting with Milner and persuaded him to let her tour some of the camps. That was Milner's big mistake. Now I'm going to ask you again to picture an image rather than words. Can you picture in 1900, or even today for that matter, a lone woman travels thousands of miles to a hostile reception in the middle of a war to deliver food and medicine to people she doesn't know and whom her country despises? That is part of the remarkable story of Emily Hobhouse. When she returned to England after seeing what was going on in the camps, she became the real journalist that so many with that title are not, and sadly are not today. She told everyone who would listen what she had seen. She flooded newspapers with articles about the camps. She spoke at public meetings. She wrote to family members. She had the ear of prominent politicians, including Lloyd George. Many publications refused to print what she had written, but enough did print it to create an international scandal that eventually saved many lives. Hers was the only voice of truth in England about the camps. So Emily's campaign to save the people that she had no connection with other than that her country was killing them was waged at great personal cost to her. The cost of standing against war and its destruction of the lives of ordinary people is never, in my view, given the attention that it deserves. Emily was motivated by her Christian faith, but she was also motivated by patriotism. She thought her country was better than that and would do something if only people knew what was happening. And I wonder if that is what we see as patriotism today, or a part of what we see as patriotism today. For her trouble, she was vilified in the press of this Christian country and damned as an unpatriotic pro-Boer troublemaker. One newspaper justified Kitchener with a line that would be echoed in future wars, especially one that I am quite familiar with. And this was the quote in the newspaper: "Women and children are frequently employed to carry messages. Of course, they must be included in military measures and transported or dispatched." Speaking at public meetings, Emily was heckled as a traitor and had stones, fruit, and even chairs thrown at her. And perhaps more painful, she was shunned by some of her friends and family members. Can any of us picture ourselves doing a fraction of what Emily Hobhouse did at that cost? But I would hasten also to add that it is a cost that has been paid by many, many peacemakers over the years, not just Emily. Milner saw that this uproar over the camps was his biggest obstacle to pursuing the war, and he was actually forced to return to London to deal with these pro-Boer ravings. He had Emily under surveillance, another burden that peacemakers often have to deal with, and he reviewed 60 spy reports on what the government called this dumpy, hysterical 41-year-old spinster troublemaker. But he could not contain the scandal. Emily decided to return to South Africa, and this time Milner was taking no chances. He barred her from coming ashore, detained her in spite of her deteriorating health, and sent her back to England on a troop ship. But the damage was done. Conditions improved, the death rate went down dramatically, and Kitchener eventually stopped ordering his commanders to bring women and children to the camps. The courage and tenacity of Emily Hobhouse in the face of public opinion, in time of war, at great personal cost, had saved thousands of lives. And she was not finished. A little bit about Emily and the Great War. Only a dozen years after this South African dress rehearsal, the big production being remembered this year began, and Britain again called on Canada. It was not a struggle for freedom and democracy and justice. It was a petty imperial squabble that got terribly out of hand. It took the lives of 60,000 Canadians in a country of only 8 million, and the limbs and mental health of tens of thousands more, including, I suspect, some of your relatives. It killed 1 million soldiers of the empire, twice that many in Russia, and triple that many in Germany. And as usual, these military deaths were counted as carefully as possible. As usual, civilian deaths are only estimated, but the most reliable estimates top out at about 13 million. That was the Great War. Both military and civilian lives would have been saved had the great powers taken seriously the peace initiatives of Emily Hobhouse before and during the war. And after the war, she continued to save civilian lives with humanitarian work which she carried out in spite of her own failing health. And before we look at that briefly, another word about Canada around this time. Canada's experience at the beginning of the Great War mirrored the South African dress rehearsal for it. Once again, young men mobbed recruiting stations seeking adventure and a part in the victory that would be won by Christmas. Once again, Laurier cautiously tried to compromise and employ half measures in response to Mother's Call. Once again, Bourassa was the voice of Canadians against the war, though even he eventually came around. And once again, Canadians fought with remarkable skill and bravery in spite of criminally bad, life-wasting British leadership, all giving rise to the glorious coming of age at Vimy myth and its implication that Canada can and should be a warrior nation. In the pivotal year of 1916, Emily became the only person from any of the warring countries to journey to the other side in search of peace. This was the most opportune year, really, to end this war, to end the slaughter. It was the year that Field Marshal Douglas Haig's insane frontal assaults at the Somme produced 60,000 British casualties on the first day, on the way to an Allied count of nearly 1 million, including 25,000 Canadians in that campaign alone. After the Somme, in Haig's war of attrition, he would thereafter assume that any day when 5,000 or fewer of his own people were not killed was not a good day, because it meant the war of attrition was not going well enough. That was Douglas Haig. But 1916 was also the year that reality began to set in. Most soldiers finally knew that the propaganda was bunk, and they concentrated, as soldiers in every war do, on their own survival and the survival of their buddies. And in Berlin, 50,000 munitions workers walked off the job to protest the jailing of a peace advocate there. And the public began to turn against the war. And the early stages of Canada's divisive conscription dispute, which would be played out again later, began to come forth. It was the year that peace should have happened, and Emily Hobhouse wanted to make it happen. In the previous year, in 1915, in very poor health, in spite of the government denying her passports and travel permits, because she was, in the words of one Foreign Office official, a woman known to have indulged in absurd and undesirable conduct, Emily had traveled as much as Europe as she could, linking with peace organizations and assessing as best she could the condition of civilians. In July of that year, she met in Switzerland with Baron von Romberg, the minister of the German legation. And they spoke of the British blockade of Germany that was starving civilians in that country, and the deadly German campaign of submarine warfare, which was doing the same to the British. Emily said that she hoped that her country would take the lead in agreeing to abandon the blockade in return for Germany ceasing the submarine campaign. Now, this idea didn't go anywhere, in part for the usual playground reason. He has to go first, that we still hear today, with Romberg telling her that Germany had already done its part because it had offered that deal to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, that it was willing to make that exchange. Now, maybe Romberg was lying. Maybe he was sincere, but he didn't know the German government, his own government, well enough. But think what might have come about. Think what might have come about if both sides had been willing just to talk about it. How many lives might have been saved? Think also again about this incredible image. A 55-year-old female private citizen, harassed by her government, sitting down with an official of the country hers is at war with, and exchanging ideas on a partial peace measure in the most disastrous war the world has ever seen. Only an extraordinary person could be a part of such a picture. And that was just the beginning for Emily Hobhouse. In the middle of the critical year of 1916 that I've described, she managed to get to Berlin and meet with the German foreign minister, Gottlieb von Jagow. She had a three-part agenda: get peace talks moving, obtain the release of interned civilians in the warring countries, get better food and relief supplies, particularly to the people of Belgium. And she came away with the impression that von Jagow was willing to talk seriously about her proposal in part at least for a mutual exchange of all civilian prisoners who were not of military age, and perhaps interning potential soldiers in neutral countries. And they also spoke of negotiating a partial lifting of the British naval blockade to allow much needed food to reach occupied Belgium. So, however realistic or fanciful the prospects for her peace agenda were, her agenda items grand and small, Emily was of the school who saw no harm in speaking to one's enemy. Who else should one speak to? She wrote, "A bridge is needed. Let me be that bridge. I have begun to build it, and I'm not afraid to cross it alone to begin with." So she returned to England, expecting that Van Jago's British counterpart, Sir Edward Grey, would be anxious to hear her report about what had gone on. She was interrogated upon her arrival, but by Scotland Yard. There followed a high-level discussion, not about peace, but about whether they could jail Emily. It turned out there was no law against what she had done. Parliament promptly passed one. And a few months later, giving no credit to her, Britain and Germany agreed to a civilian prisoner exchange almost exactly as she had proposed. Final thoughts on what can a person do in reaction to such a story. It's been a great joy for me to learn about Emily Hobhouse while researching my book on Canada and other people's wars. But what can we do after we learn? The example of Emily Hobhouse has certainly taught us that if we're interested in peace, we can't use the fact that we're just ordinary citizens and we're not rich and we're not politically powerful as an excuse to do nothing. So I'm going to suggest a modest beginning. Speaking and acting politely but forcefully, as Canadians do, I suggest starting with a pledge to do this. 1, do all you can to ensure that every remembrance in this great war centennial and every November thereafter is directed at remembering and honoring the sacrifice of military and civilian lives and never simply glorifying the wars that took those lives. 2, let the peacemakers know that you stand with them. Do not be silent when government officials or even your friends and neighbors impugn their patriotism. Believe me, that hurts, and your support is very much appreciated in those instances. 3, challenge the notion that the only heroes are those in uniform and that all in uniform are heroes. That practice does a disservice to heroes both in and out of uniform. Finally, learn and speak about other heroes. Emily Hobhouse is not the only one. She just happens to be my favorite.